There is belief, and then there is skepticism. And between the two lies a vast territory of questions and the unknown. But what if reality is far more complex than we've been willing to perceive? And what if the stories we dismissed as mere myth and legend hold the keys to understanding consciousness? From ghostly encounters to lights in the sky, humanity has always sensed there was something more out there. Some call it the paranormal, and others call it the divine. Some look to the stars for answers, while others search within. Philosophy asks why, theology asks who, science asks how, and we ask ourselves, what if? We stand at a meeting point, a place where the fabric between realities is thinner than you might think. This is Crossroads of the Veil. There are stories that live in the shadows of our history. They are not simply forgotten tales, but stories that have been actively buried under layers of secrecy and denial. They are stories of power that slipped its leash, of science that lost its soul, and of a government that, in its search for a weapon, turned it against its own people. This is the story of a secret war for the ultimate territory, the human mind itself. It is a story that begins in fear, is executed in darkness, and leaves behind a legacy of broken lives and the poison of paranoia that lingers to this day. This is the story of Project MKUltra. It emerged from the intense paranoia of the late 1940s and early 1950s. The hard-won peace of World War II had given way to a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. This wasn't a war of marching armies, but a silent battle for men's minds between the United States and the Soviet Union, fueled by pervasive anxiety and a stark ideological divide that painted the world in black and white. The air seemed thick with suspicion. Children practiced hiding under their desks in case of nuclear attack, and the fear of the enemy within became as potent as the fear of the enemy abroad. Into this climate of fear, a new and terrifying word entered the American vocabulary: brainwashing, conjuring images of a person's mind being scrubbed clean of their identity and refilled with hostile enemy ideology. It represented the ultimate violation, the fear that one's own thoughts were no longer safe. This fear was given a human face by a series of shocking international events. In 1949, Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty, a staunch anti-communist leader in Hungary, was put on trial by the state. The man who appeared in the courtroom was a hollowed-out version of his former self. His testimony was a flat, robotic confession to crimes he clearly did not commit. His eyes were vacant, his demeanor listless. Newsreels of the trial played in American cinemas, and audiences were profoundly shaken. They were seeing what looked like a man whose soul had been stolen. The fear intensified dramatically with the end of the Korean War. American prisoners of war began to return home, but some seemed converted. Men sent to fight communism were now delivering rehearsed, glassy-eyed confessions of American war crimes on camera. Some even refused repatriation, choosing to stay in China. The media exploded with sensational headlines about communist brainwashers, creating a national panic. If American soldiers could be so easily broken and turned, then who was safe? A new kind of arms race was declared, not for nuclear warheads, but for psychological weapons. A terrifying mind control gap was perceived, a deep-seated fear that America was lagging dangerously behind the Soviets. In this climate of escalating fear, Allen Dulles was appointed director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was a pillar of the American establishment, whose brother John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State. He was the embodiment of authority, a man who saw the world as a grand chessboard where difficult, even dirty moves had to be made to ensure victory. On April 10, 1953, Dulles delivered a pivotal speech to a gathering of Princeton alumni. He described a new, insidious threat from the Soviet Union: brain warfare. He painted a chilling picture of a new battlefield, the human mind itself, and characterized the alleged Soviet methods as abhorrent and nefarious, techniques designed to erode free will and create a robot-like state in their victims. He implied that America's democratic principles were a liability in this brutal conflict for psychological dominance. Then, with breathtaking hypocrisy, on April 13, 1953, just 3 days after publicly condemning the nefarious methods of Soviet brain warfare, Allen Dulles officially approved Project MKUltra. He had created the public justification for a program that would employ the very techniques he had just decried. Its goal was to fight fire with fire, to master the perceived mind control capabilities of the enemy. The terrible truth, revealed only through later analysis, was that the CIA was chasing a ghost. The dramatic cases that had fueled the national panic were almost certainly the products of classic, brutal coercion. Fatigue, hunger, sleep deprivation, and torture. There was no magic bullet. But the CIA, under Dulles' leadership, chose to believe in one. The mind control gap was not a reality they discovered, but a narrative they constructed. It was a manufactured crisis that provided the perfect justification for a program that would operate without oversight, without ethics, and without mercy. New York City, November the 28th, 1953. The concrete canyons of Manhattan are hushed in the pre-dawn hours. Our focus narrows to a single illuminated window on the 13th floor of the Hotel Statler. Inside that room, 2 men are in conversation. Then at 2:30 a.m., the morning silence is shattered by the sound of a body flailing through the blackness before crashing into the sidewalk below on 7th Avenue. The impact is brutal, a sound of finality. The man is Dr. Frank Olson. He was a brilliant biochemist for the United States Army, a patriot, a husband, and a father of 3, working at the secretive heart of America's biological warfare program. His work was grim and classified. He was an expert in aerobiology, the study of how to disperse deadly toxins through the air. He had been involved in top-secret programs like Operation Sea Spray, an experiment where the military released bacteria into the fog of San Francisco to test dispersal patterns on an unsuspecting American population. But this work, this daily proximity to death on a mass scale, had begun to take a profound psychological toll. His son Eric would later recall the horror his father felt. He would come home, his face ashen, and talk about seeing the test subjects for these horrific new weapons. Olson had become a witness to the agency's darkest secrets. On recent trips to Europe, he had observed brutal human interrogations in CIA safe houses, secret black sites where men were, in his horrified words, literally interrogated to death. The moral weight of it was crushing him. He wanted out. He had told his superiors he was going to resign. By the time the first responders arrive at the Hotel Statler, the official narrative is already taking shape: suicide. A brilliant man, overwhelmed by the pressures of his secret work, simply broke. It was a neat bow tied around a messy and violent event. But even in those first moments, the official story felt thin, like a hastily drawn curtain over a scene of terrible violence. The real truth lies back up in that room on the 13th floor. It lies with the other man, Robert Lashbrook, an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency. His behavior immediately following his colleague's plunge to his death is not that of a shocked and grieving friend. It is the cold, procedural behavior of an intelligence operative managing a crisis. There is no frantic call to the police or for an ambulance. Instead, Lashbrook calmly picks up the telephone. The hotel's night operator, listening in as was standard practice, recalled the chillingly brief exchange. Lashbrook's voice is steady and controlled. He reports to the unknown person on the other end, in a flat tone, "Well, he's gone." The reply is equally devoid of emotion. "Well, that's too bad." Then a sharp click. Lashbrook places the receiver back in its cradle. He sits with his head in his hands, not in grief, but in waiting. The physical evidence in the room screams its own silent, contradictory testimony. The hotel doorman, the first to reach Olson's body, would later recall looking up at the window from which Olson had supposedly leaped. The heavy window shade was still pulled all the way down. The thick hotel curtains were still drawn closed. As the doorman would state years later, nobody jumps through a window and dashes through the drape. There's no sense to that. A man in the throes of a suicidal impulse does not pause to run an obstacle course, and a colleague does not react to such a horror with a cryptic coded phone call. The official story is not an explanation, it is a cover. For 22 years, that cover held. It wasn't until the great congressional investigations of the CIA in 1975 that the first crack appeared in this wall of lies. The truth, when it finally began to emerge, was far more sinister. 9 days before his fatal plunge, during a work retreat, Frank Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD by his own CIA colleagues. The drug was slipped into his glass after dinner without his knowledge or consent. The man who personally ordered the drugging was the head of the CIA's mind control program himself, Sidney Gottlieb. Olson's subsequent psychological breakdown, his severe paranoia, and his desperate confession to his wife was not a spontaneous mental collapse. It was the direct catastrophic result of a non-consensual clandestine human experiment. His death was not a suicide. It was the first documented American casualty of this secret war for the mind. Decades later, in 1994, Olson's sons had their father's body exhumed. They hired Dr. James E. Starrs, a renowned forensic pathologist, to perform a new autopsy. Dr. Starrs' findings were explosive. He found no evidence of the cuts and lacerations one would expect from crashing through a glass window. What he did find, however, was a large, previously undocumented hematoma on Olson's forehead, clear evidence of significant blunt force trauma sustained before the fall. The evidence suggested a struggle, an execution. Following this new evidence, the New York District Attorney quietly changed the official cause of death on Frank Olson's death certificate from suicide to unknown. But it is Robert Lashbrook's calm response in that hotel room that reveals the deepest horror. It suggests that the death of a human subject, even a high-level colleague who had seen too much and become a security risk, was not an unforeseen tragedy. It was a contingency, an acceptable risk for which a protocol already existed. The true terror of Frank Olson's story is that his death was handled with the detached efficiency of a failed experiment being cleaned up. This transforms Olson's death from a singular crime into chilling evidence of a systemic, amoral operational mindset at the heart of the CIA. The agency didn't just stumble into a tragedy. They had a playbook for it, and that playbook had a name. Project MKUltra was the final logical step on a path the CIA had been paving for nearly a decade. It was the culmination of an accelerating trajectory of ethical erosion, a journey into darkness where each transgressive step made the next one seem necessary. The Hydra-headed enterprise of mind control grew from 3 distinct sources of moral corruption. The first was Operation Paperclip. In the aftermath of World War II, the U.S. government initiated a top-secret program to recruit more than 1,600 of Germany and Austria's most brilliant scientists and engineers. The objective was to leverage their expertise for the burgeoning Cold War and deny it to the Soviets. But this strategic imperative led to a profound moral compromise. President Harry S. Truman had explicitly forbidden the recruitment of any individual who had been an ardent Nazi or was complicit in war crimes. It was a clear moral line. But intelligence officials on the ground systematically circumvented this direct presidential order. They engaged in a process of historical sanitation they called bleaching. They went through the records of high-value scientific targets and deliberately expunged any references to their membership in the Nazi Party or their involvement in atrocities. Among the men whose files were bleached were Nazi doctors who had conducted barbaric human experiments in concentration camps. These men had tested interrogation techniques and hallucinogens on prisoners, pushing the limits of human endurance through unimaginable torture, all in the name of science. This act of recruitment wasn't just about acquiring talent, it was about importing a grotesque ethos. It was the importation of a methodology of human experimentation stripped of all humanity, where ethical boundaries were obliterated for a perceived greater good. The precedent was set. For national security, certain men were exempt from moral judgment, and their horrific knowledge was a valuable asset. Concurrently, the U.S. Navy embarked on its own dark quest with Project Chatter, initiated in 1947. Its objective was to develop a truth drug for interrogations. Researchers experimented with a wide range of substances, from barbiturates to mescaline. Significantly, Chater conducted the first known U.S. government experiments with LSD on human subjects. One of the earliest drugs they explored was scopolamine, which was used in obstetrics to induce a twilight sleep, where women giving birth remained conscious but would have no memory of the pain. Obstetricians observed that women in this state became exceedingly candid, sparking the interest of intelligence agencies. However, its utility was undermined by severe side effects, including terrifying hallucinations, profound disorientation, and a rapid heart rate. The drug was simply too messy for reliable use. As Chater faded, the newly formed CIA took up the mantle with Project Bluebird, which began in 1950. This marked the CIA's first institutional foray into mind control. Its initial objectives were a mix of defensive and offensive ambitions: to condition its own personnel to resist enemy interrogation, and to investigate controlling an individual's behavior through hypnosis and drugs. But the line between defense and offense was already beginning to blur. 1 year later, in 1951, the program was reborn as Project Artichoke. The pretense of a primarily defensive mission was dropped. The project's scope expanded dramatically, and its central objective became explicitly offensive. Declassified documents asked the question in terrifying terms: could an individual be made to involuntarily perform an act of attempted assassination? With Artichoke, the human subject was no longer just a source of information, but a potential weapon to be aimed and fired. The experiments were conducted far from public view, in overseas black sites, secret prisons across Europe and Asia. The subjects were designated with the sterile term aliens, a euphemism for unwilling foreign nationals, captured enemy agents, or other disposable individuals. In these hidden facilities, interrogators used a terrifying cocktail of methods: LSD, heroin, hypnosis, and extreme isolation, to shatter their subjects' sense of reality. The agency's interest in narco-hypnosis was particularly intense, exploring whether drugs could induce a deep trance to exploit psychological vulnerabilities and create a real-life Manchurian candidate. This step-by-step escalation, from importing Nazi science in paperclip, to the drug tests of Chater, to the hypnotic programming of Bluebird and Artichoke, created the foundation for the ultimate program. In the very names of these projects, we can see a chilling poetry of evil. Bluebird, a symbol of happiness, was a perverse mask for psychological violation. Artichoke was a terrifying metaphor for the project's methodology, the systematic peeling away of a person's layers to expose and control the heart of their being. And the name that would follow, Ultra, was a deliberate homage to the highest level of Allied intelligence secrecy in World War II. It signaled a project of supreme national importance, operating above all normal rules and laws. The culmination of these forays into darkness arrived on April 13, 1953, with the official initiation of Project MKUltra. The MMK prefix signified that the project originated from the Technical Services Staff, the division responsible for spy gadgets and poisons. The Ultra designation signaled its extreme importance. Under this name, a vast array of horrifying experiments would be conducted. MKUltra was not a small rogue operation. It was a sprawling enterprise, protected by key figures at the highest levels of the CIA. At the top was Allen Dulles, the first civilian director of Central Intelligence. As the ultimate authority, he granted the project its charter. Critically, he approved a special funding mechanism that funneled money to MKUltra through other government departments, completely bypassing normal congressional oversight. This created a moral and legal vacuum, a black budget for a black project where any abuse could flourish. Next was Richard Helms, the quintessential intelligence professional who provided institutional armor for the program. Described by his own biographer as a gentlemanly planner of assassinations, Helms drafted the initial proposal for MKUltra and worked tirelessly to ensure its protection from any scrutiny. His commitment to secrecy was absolute, culminating 2 decades later in his 1973 order to destroy all of the program's records. Finally, there was the program's dark beating heart, its scientific engine, Sidney Gottlieb, known to his colleagues as the Black Sorcerer. Gottlieb was a brilliant biochemist and a man of profound contradictions. Born to Hungarian Jewish immigrants, he was ostracized for his disabilities, a clubfoot and a severe stutter, but he excelled academically, earning a PhD in biochemistry. He was a spiritual seeker who lived a rustic life in a remote cabin without running water, rising before dawn to milk his goats and practice folk dancing. Yet this same man presided over a program of systematic torture and murder. He personally approved the most depraved sub-projects and was directly involved in the drugging of Frank Olson. His fervent patriotism, combined with a mystical belief that LSD was the key that could unlock the universe, drove the program's relentless pharmacological focus. Under Gottlieb's direction, MKUltra became a sprawling enterprise of at least 149 known sub-projects. It was a desperate fishing expedition, throwing every conceivable technique at the human mind to see what might stick. The methods they explored can be grouped into a catalog of horrors. Pharmacological experimentation. This was the core of MKUltra. Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to purchase the entire world supply of LSD from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland. The CIA became the primary vector for the distribution of LSD in the United States in the 1950s. The drug was tested on the most vulnerable populations. Prisoners, seen as a disposable resource, were a primary target. In the Atlanta penitentiary, a young inmate named James Whitey Bulger, the future Boston mob boss, was dosed with LSD daily for over a year, having been told he was in a study to find a cure for schizophrenia. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, a CIA-funded researcher conducted horrific experiments on incarcerated African-American drug addicts, giving them massive doses of LSD for 77 consecutive days and then offering them heroin as a reward for their participation. A monstrous act of coercive exploitation. Psychological and physical torture. The program funded extensive research into hypnosis as a weapon. They sought to create hypnotically induced anxieties, implant false memories, and program individuals to carry out complex acts against their will. Other methods were even more brutal. Researchers explored prolonged sensory deprivation, isolating subjects in dark, soundproof rooms for weeks on end to induce psychosis and break their fundamental sense of reality. Physiological assaults. Researchers also explored direct physical assaults on the brain. Sub-Project 54, the Navy's Perfect Concussion Program, investigated the use of suboral frequency blasts to erase memory without leaving a physical trace. The agency also closely monitored neuroscientist Jose Delgado at Yale, whose research involved implanting electrodes into the brains of animals, including a famous experiment where he stopped a charging bull with a radio transmitter. This demonstration of remote control over a living being's will was of immense interest to the CIA. Esoteric inquiries. The program's desperation led it down some truly bizarre paths. Under Sub-Project 4, Gottlieb hired John Mulholland, a famous stage magician, to write a manual on sleight of hand and deception, teaching CIA agents how to surreptitiously administer drugs to unsuspecting targets. A later successor program was created to explore the world of black magic and the occult, to determine if these systems contained psychological principles that could be weaponized. This monstrous enterprise was not conducted in secret CIA bunkers alone. In a move of bureaucratic genius, Gottlieb outsourced the work. The program funneled money through a network of over 86 institutions, including prestigious universities like Stanford and Harvard, as well as major hospitals and federal prisons. The funding was laundered through front organizations with innocuous-sounding names, like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, to ensure the researchers themselves often had no idea their work was financed by the CIA. This was a calculated laundering of atrocity, a system designed to provide a veneer of legitimacy. If any single experiment were exposed, the blame could be placed on a rogue doctor or an independent foundation, with the CIA connection safely deniable. 2 case studies reveal the absolute depths of this betrayal. The first is the work of Dr. D. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. Cameron was a titan of his field, a former president of both the American and World Psychiatric Associations. Under MKUltra Sub-Project 68, he pursued his radical theory of depatterning. He believed that to cure mental illness, one must first completely obliterate the patient's existing mind. Patients, many with minor issues like anxiety or postpartum depression, were subjected to his horrific treatment. They were placed into drug-induced comas for months and subjected to massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy, sometimes at 40 times the normal intensity. Once Cameron believed a patient's mind was a blank slate, he would begin psychic driving, forcing them to listen to looped audio messages for up to 20 hours a day. The human cost was catastrophic. Patients emerged unable to recognize their own families, having to relearn everything like a small child. The second case study is Operation Midnight Climax. This infamous sub-project, run out of San Francisco and New York by a narcotics agent named George Hunter White, represented the program's absolute moral depravity. White established agency-funded safe houses disguised as brothels. The safe houses were elaborately bugged with one-way mirrors and hidden microphones. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll were instructed to lure unsuspecting men back to the safe house, where their drinks would be spiked with LSD. From a hidden room, White and other CIA officers would sit on a portable toilet, drinking martinis and taking notes as they watched the subjects' reactions, studying the drug's effects and its potential for sexual blackmail. The operation was characterized by a freewheeling party-like atmosphere, devoid of any scientific control or medical oversight. George Hunter White's chilling mindset was captured in a letter he later wrote to his boss, Sidney Gottlieb. "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill and cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage, with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" By 1963, a decade after its inception, even the CIA's own leadership was becoming aware that Project MKUltra had spiraled out of control. The agency's Inspector General, John Ehrman, was tasked with conducting a review of the program. His final report, delivered that year, is a stunning document, a formal indictment of MKUltra from within the agency. Ehrman's report did not pull its punches. He raised distasteful and unethical concerns about testing dangerous drugs on unwitting American citizens. He slammed the program's philosophy of minimum documentation, a deliberate policy that made any real oversight impossible. He noted with alarm that only 2 individuals, Gottlieb and his deputy, had full knowledge of the program's vast scope, and that most of that knowledge was unrecorded. He pointed out that after 10 years and millions of dollars, the program's practical results were often unpredictable and operationally marginal at best. As of 1960, he wrote, no effective knockout pill, truth serum, aphrodisiac, or recruitment pill was known to exist. The magic bullet remained a fantasy. The report's final recommendation was a potential turning point. The Inspector General formally advised that the agency terminate all testing of substances on unwitting U.S. citizens. But this recommendation came with a chilling caveat. The primary reason given was not moral outrage, but the high risk of embarrassment to the agency if the program were ever exposed. And in the same breath, the report made it clear that this unethical testing could and should continue on foreign nationals in overseas black sites, where the risk of exposure were lower. The IG coolly noted that deep cover agents overseas were more favorably situated to carry out such work. This moment reveals the cold bureaucratic logic that enables atrocity. The primary objection was not that the program was immoral, but that it was risky to the agency's reputation. Public relations, not human rights, was the main concern. Morality was reduced to just another variable in a cost-benefit analysis. Here was the moment of truth for the CIA's leadership. They had been officially warned, in writing, that the program was unethical, dangerous, and poorly managed. The logical path would have been to heed the warning. They should have shut down the most egregious sub-projects like Operation Midnight Climax and reined in Sidney Gottlieb. What happened instead was a conscious act of defiance. A high-level meeting was held to decide the program's fate. On one side were officials like Inspector General Ehrman, who argued for restraint. On the other were the program's true believers, its chief, Sidney Gottlieb, and his powerful superior and protector, Richard Helms. Helms and Gottlieb argued forcefully to continue the unwitting tests on Americans. They claimed that without such realistic testing, the agency's capabilities would diminish, leaving them vulnerable to imagined Soviet advances. They insisted that testing on prisoners or foreign nationals was not enough. To understand how these techniques would work in a real-world American setting, they had to be tested on unsuspecting Americans. Their argument won. The Inspector General's recommendations were formally overruled by the highest levels of the CIA. Operation Midnight Climax remained open for another year. This was not a case of bureaucratic drift or a lack of oversight. This was a case of the agency's leadership being presented with a clear, documented account of the program's illegality and profound risks, and formally, consciously deciding to do it anyway. It was a conscious rejection of ethical oversight in favor of operational expediency. This moment cemented the program's status not as a rogue operation, but as a sanctioned, protected, and willfully criminal enterprise, knowingly embraced by the men at the very top. Our story now leaps forward a decade, to the early 1970s, a moment of crisis within the CIA. The atmosphere of impunity the agency had enjoyed for a generation was rapidly evaporating. The Watergate scandal was metastasizing into a full-blown constitutional crisis, bringing unwelcome scrutiny upon the entire executive branch. Journalists were digging deeper than ever before. Congress was beginning to ask pointed questions about the limits of government power. The American public's trust in its government was eroded by the Vietnam War and shattered by Watergate. For men like Richard Helms and Sidney Gottlieb, the walls were closing in. In 1973, with these storm clouds gathering, the now Director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms, the same Richard Helms who had championed the continuation of unwitting drug tests a decade earlier, gave a fateful order. He commanded that all files, all records, and all documentation pertaining to the 2 decades of Project MKUltra were to be collected and systematically destroyed. This was not routine bureaucratic house cleaning. It was the story's ultimate disaster, and arguably the program's most profound and lasting crime. It was a deliberate, calculated effort to erase history, to incinerate the evidence of torture, abuse, and murder, and to forever shield the agency and its leaders from any form of accountability. It was a clear statement that the CIA believed it existed above the law, with the power to be the sole arbiter of its own history. Years later, when called to testify before Congress, Helms would offer a sanitized justification for his actions. He claimed he had ordered the destruction primarily to protect the privacy and professional reputations of the many outsiders. He claimed he was trying to spare them the embarrassment of being publicly associated with the agency's dirty work. This explanation, of course, was a transparent lie, a thin veil for his real motive: to hide indefensible crimes and obstruct any future investigation. The act of destroying the evidence was the most damning evidence of guilt. Innocent men do not build bonfires with their records. The purge was brutally effective. The vast majority of the program's records, the detailed research proposals, the experimental results, the names of victims, were turned to ash. When congressional investigators finally began their work 2 years later, they were confronted with a gaping black hole in the historical record. They knew a monster had existed, but its full shape and size had been deliberately obscured. But history has a strange way of preserving its ghosts. In an act of profound bureaucratic clumsiness, a small but precious cache of financial records, some 7 boxes containing roughly 20,000 pages, had been misfiled in a budget and planning office and had survived the Great Bonfire. These were not operational files. They were dry accounting ledgers filled with invoices and payment authorizations. They contained no detailed experimental results or victim testimonies, but they did contain names, dates, and institutional affiliations. These dry financial records would become the Rosetta Stone for deciphering the ruins of a secret criminal empire. The destruction of the MKUltra files was the final logical act of a program built on the principle of absolute, unaccountable secrecy. The philosophy of minimum documentation had simply reached its ultimate conclusion. The bonfire was the ultimate expression of the very ideology that had created MKUltra. The act of destruction did not end the story. It ensured that the story would never truly end. By burning the evidence, the CIA created a void, and into that void, a new generation of fears, suspicions, and conspiracies would rush in to flourish. Despite Richard Helms's efforts to hide it, the truth about the CIA's illegal activities emerged. In December 1974, Seymour Hersh's New York Times report exposed the CIA's domestic spying, including on anti-war activists. This post-Watergate expose caused a national political uproar. Public outrage over the intelligence community led to the formation of the Church Committee in the Senate, chaired by Senator Frank Church, and the Rockefeller Commission, led by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, established by President Gerald Ford. Both convened in 1975 to investigate. Hearings revealed Project MKUltra, a nationwide conspiracy of state-sanctioned abuse, with Dr. Frank Olson's case central. The Rockefeller Commission's report confirmed LSD was illegally administered to unwitting subjects, leading to one death in 1953. The secret was out. Then in 1977, a shocking discovery was made. Author John Marks, working on a book about the CIA, filed a Freedom of Information Act request for any records related to MKUltra. His request spurred a new search within the agency, which unearthed the 7 boxes of financial records that had survived the 1973 purge. The shocking revelations led directly to reforms. In 1976, President Gerald Ford issued Executive Order 11905. It was a direct response to the abuses the committees had uncovered. Its most significant provision, born from the exposure of MKUltra, explicitly prohibited experimentation with drugs on human subjects, except with the informed consent of each such human subject. And in its most famous clause, it stated unequivocally, "No employee of the United States government shall engage in or conspire to engage in political assassination." Although the guilty parties were publicly exposed, they never faced criminal charges. New regulations were implemented to prevent a recurrence of the MKUltra program, bringing a fragile sense of closure to the situation. But this peace was an illusion. The reforms, while significant, were also limited. The executive order, for instance, failed to provide a clear legal definition for assassination. This ambiguity was a deliberate loophole. It has allowed subsequent administrations to interpret the ban narrowly, authorizing so-called targeted killings of suspected terrorists. Critics argue these are simply assassinations by another name. The reversal was incomplete. The system had absorbed the scandal, created the appearance of accountability, and quietly left its core operational capabilities intact, ready for future use under new names and new justifications. The true lasting legacy of Project MKUltra was not reform. It was the creation of a poisoned well of public distrust from which modern conspiracy culture continues to drink. The deliberate destruction of the program's records by Richard Helms did more than cover up crimes. It created a permanent and toxic information vacuum. This void in the official historical record became fertile ground for the rise of new, more elaborate, and often more terrifying narratives that sought to explain what was in those burned files. The absence of official truth invited speculative fiction to masquerade as fact. The most prominent of these narratives is the unverified conspiracy theory known as Project Monarch. This theory, which gained traction in the 1990s, describes a far more systematic and occult-based program of trauma-based mind control than anything documented in the surviving MKUltra files. It is crucial to state that the term Project Monarch does not appear in any of the thousands of pages of declassified government documents. It emerged decades after the program was terminated, primarily through the self-published writings of alleged survivors. Project Monarch is a conspiracy theory detailing a mind control method that creates programmable human slaves through childhood trauma, leading to dissociative identities that can be triggered by symbolic cues. This theory, which emerged in the 1980s and 90s, intertwined with the satanic ritual abuse panic and recovered memory therapy. It is seen as a secular version of the satanic ritual abuse conspiracy, replacing Satan with the CIA and drawing credibility from the documented abuses of MKUltra. The theory's narrative functions as modern folklore, providing an external explanation for the profound suffering associated with severe dissociative identity disorder, a genuine psychiatric condition. This brings us to the final lingering question. Did the program ever truly end? Or was it simply reclassified, rebranded, and driven deeper into the shadows? The official record states that Project MKUltra was terminated in 1973. However, the declassified documents reveal a more complicated picture. The name may have changed, but the work continued through a tangled web of overlapping projects. MKUltra was succeeded by, and ran concurrently with, a program called MKSearch, which in turn contained its own sub-projects like MKOften. Running parallel to this were programs like MKNaomi, focused on biological weapons, and MKDelta, which governed the operational use of all these materials. The names are confusing, but the thread of research and intent is clear. The quest for control continued under new cryptonyms. MKSearch, approved in 1964, was less a new project and more a rebranding of MKUltra's core objectives. While early MKUltra had been a chaotic fishing expedition, MKSearch aimed to refine research into behavior-modifying drugs for specific operational uses, like a perfect truth serum or advanced incapacitating agents. Under this banner, some of the most bizarre inquiries continued. One MK, Chickwit, was a global intelligence operation to identify and acquire novel psychoactive substances from researchers in Europe and Asia. The goal was to ensure no foreign power developed a new mind-altering drug the U.S. didn't possess, and to find new compounds that could be weaponized. Perhaps the most telling example of the agency's desperation was MKOften, a sub-project that delved into the occult. Launched in the late 1960s, its mandate was to study witchcraft, fortune-telling, and black magic to see if they contained principles that could be exploited for psychological warfare. This was not a metaphorical inquiry. The project examined ancient texts on demonology and consulted with astrologers, rationalizing that if these ancient belief systems could exert powerful psychological influence, the CIA needed to understand how. MKOften reveals the intellectual bankruptcy at the heart of the mind control quest. Having failed for 2 decades to find a reliable magic bullet in the laboratory, the agency turned to literal magic as a last resort. Running parallel was Project MKNaomi, a joint venture between the CIA and the Army Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick. Its purpose was chillingly direct: to create and stockpile an arsenal of deadly biological agents and chemical toxins for the CIA's exclusive use. MKNaomi was not about mind control, it was about assassination. The project developed lethal substances like shellfish toxin and botulinum toxin, focusing on poisons that could kill in a way that mimicked natural causes, making the assassination untraceable. During the Church Committee hearings, the public was stunned by the revelation of one of MKNaomi's most infamous creations, a special pistol capable of firing a small, ice-coated dart containing a lethal toxin. The dart would penetrate the skin, melt almost instantly, and leave only a tiny red mark, like a mosquito bite. The victim would then die within minutes from what appeared to be a massive heart attack. If MKNaomi was the armory, MKDelta was the program that authorized pulling the trigger. MKDelta was the designation for the operational use of both MKUltra mind-altering materials and MKNaomi lethal agents in the field. It was the approval channel for using these secret techniques in clandestine operations, such as the multiple attempts on the life of Cuban leader Fidel Castro. It represents the crucial link between laboratory experiments and the violent reality of covert operations. But what about today? The off-the-books funding that protected MKUltra was made obsolete by the very investigations that exposed it. In its place, a far more robust and legally defensible architecture of secrecy was constructed. Today, the government's most sensitive projects are housed within special access programs. There are acknowledged special access programs whose existence is public, and then there are unacknowledged special access programs, projects so secret their very existence is a classified fact. Even more secret are waived special access programs, which are exempt from most congressional reporting requirements altogether. This modern framework provides the perfect structure to house a program like MKUltra, making it even more invisible than its predecessor. The public outcry of the 1970s did not end secrecy, it simply perfected it. The technology has not stood still. The crude drugs of the 1950s have been superseded by a new and potentially more terrifying frontier: neurowarfare. Experts like Dr. James Giordano, who advises DARPA, have spoken about the rapid weaponization of the brain sciences. This new battlescape includes neuroweapons designed to degrade an adversary's cognitive function, brain-computer interfaces that raise profound ethical questions, and cognitive warfare, a strategy to manipulate perception on a societal scale through disinformation. The strategic goals, control, manipulation, and deception, remain the same. The phenomenon of Havana syndrome should not be viewed as a modern mystery, but as the chilling operational success of a concept born decades earlier in the shadows of the Cold War. The perfect concussion sought by the CIA Subproject 54, an untraceable, non-contact brain injury, laid the theoretical groundwork for the invisible wounds afflicting today's personnel. Its core scientific principle, the resonance cavitation theory, is now echoed in the leading explanation for the debilitating symptoms seen in modern victims: neurological damage caused by tiny energy-induced shockwaves within the skull. Havana syndrome is, in essence, the grim perfection of that original goal, a weapon refined over 70 years that has moved from a theoretical blueprint to a devastatingly effective reality, turning the human mind into the ultimate battlefield. The 2023 declassified combined intelligence black budget reaches $99.6 billion. So, did MKUltra ever truly end? There is no declassified smoking gun to prove its direct continuation, but the circumstantial evidence paints an unsettling picture. The documented successor programs, the perfected architecture of secrecy, and the exponential advancement of neurotechnology create a chilling and logical possibility. The battle for human minds never ended. It just evolved. While the tragic death of Dr. Frank Olson became the public face of MKUltra's recklessness, he was far from the only victim. The program's insidious tendrils reached into prisons, mental hospitals, and public spaces, leaving a hidden trail of broken minds and shattered lives. The true cost of the CIA's quest for control can only be understood by listening to the stories of those unwittingly caught in its web. In the winter of 1953, Harold Blower, a 42-year-old professional tennis player, checked himself into the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He was suffering from severe depression following a difficult divorce. He was told he would be receiving a new experimental treatment. What he was not told was that the institute was conducting secret chemical warfare research for the U.S. Army. Over several weeks, Blower was injected with a series of powerful hallucinogens. He experienced terrifying hallucinations and became increasingly agitated, begging the doctors to stop. On January 8, 1953, despite his protests, he was given a fifth and final injection, a massive intravenous dose of a mescaline derivative. He went into violent convulsions and died within 2 hours. For 22 years, the truth was buried. His death certificate attributed his death to a pre-existing heart condition. The hospital and the Army engaged in a systematic cover-up. It was only in 1975, spurred by the Church Committee's revelations, that the Blower case was re-examined. The truth finally emerged. Harold Blower was a human guinea pig killed by a secret government experiment. His family, who had been fed a lie for more than 2 decades, finally received a formal apology and a financial settlement. Before he became the infamous boss of Boston's Winter Hill Gang, James Whitey Bulger was a federal inmate at the Atlanta Penitentiary in 1957. He and 19 other inmates volunteered for what they were told was a medical study to find a cure for schizophrenia, in exchange for a reduction in their sentences. The reality was MKUltra Subproject 47. The doctor in charge was the notorious Dr. Harris Isbell. For over a year, Bulger was injected with LSD nearly every day. He experienced terrifying hallucinations and crushing paranoia that pushed him to the brink of insanity. In his own journals, he wrote that he felt he was going insane, and that the experiments were inducing suicidal thoughts. Years later, he would write, "I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me." The experience left him with lifelong insomnia, recurring nightmares, and a deep-seated hatred of the government. In its attempt to study methods of control, the CIA may have inadvertently fueled the violent rage of one of America's most notorious criminals. The horrors of Dr. D. Ewan Cameron's depatterning experiments in Montreal, secretly funded by the CIA, left a legacy of devastation. These were not prisoners or spies. They were ordinary Canadian citizens who had sought help for common ailments like anxiety and postpartum depression. One survivor, Janine Horde, was admitted for anxiety. She was put into a drug-induced coma for 86 consecutive days, subjected to repeated high-voltage electroshocks, and forced to listen to a psychic driving tape repeating a simple phrase. When she finally emerged, her mind was a wreck. She had lost years of her memory and had the mental state of a small child. Another survivor, Gail Kastner, was just a teenager when she was admitted. She emerged a completely different person, her personality fractured and her life permanently derailed. Julie Taney's father was admitted for facial pain. He was subjected to chemically induced sleep for weeks with a tape recorder under his pillow, repeating endless loops of commands. She recalled visiting him and finding a hollow shell of his former self. Most of his life vanished, she recalled. He remembered my mother, but he didn't remember he had children or that he had a business or anything. In the 1980s, a group of these Canadian survivors banded together to sue the CIA. Their legal battle was long and arduous, but they persevered, and in 1988, they won a landmark settlement. Their victory was a profound moral vindication, forcing the U.S. government to finally acknowledge the suffering it had caused on foreign soil. The stories of the Montreal survivors are an essential reminder that the victims of this program were not abstract subjects. They were mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters whose lives were irrevocably broken. The chilling saga has been the subject of numerous documentaries that seek to separate verified facts from wild speculation. Errol Morris's 2017 docudrama Wormwood is a masterful and haunting exploration of the Frank Olson case, powerfully highlighting the human cost of government secrecy. These films serve as crucial public records, ensuring the stories of the victims are not lost to the ashes of Richard Helms's bonfire. The questions remain, suspended like a persistent hum in our collective consciousness. What other truths are still hidden? How do the verified abuses of the past continue to shape our turbulent present? And what does it mean to protect the sanctity of the human mind in an increasingly invasive world? These are not questions to be dismissed as the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. They are the essential questions of a mature democracy grappling with the dark side of its own power. The story of Project MKUltra is not a closed chapter of history. It is not a dusty relic to be placed on a shelf. It is a living wound, a stark reminder that the line between national security and state-sponsored tyranny, between vigilance and violation, is perilously thin. It teaches us that the quest for absolute control, once begun, may never truly end. It may just change its name, cloak itself in new justifications, and find new, more sophisticated tools. The unseen empire did not fall in 1973. It simply learned a more effective form of camouflage, leaving us all to wonder what new names are being written on the files of projects yet to be discovered, in the deep black archives of a government that has yet to earn back our trust. As we step back from the crossroads, remember the veil between the known and the unknown is thinner than you think. But the story doesn't end here. This is just the beginning. Because what we explore here is not just about the phenomena, but the journey that we are all on, searching for our meaning and purpose in life, seeking the knowledge and wisdom to solve the deeper mysteries in our universe, and to find and fulfill our destinies. Unexplained sightings, spirits, and science. They are all connected, and they have been interwoven into the grand tapestry of life. So remember, keep pulling at the threads, because this has been Crossroads of the Veil.